Good afternoon. Today we wanted to talk about applying Occam's razor to the question of if this virus started in the wet market in Wuhan. And again, we would have the two people presenting case, one in favor of it being yes, it did start there, and one not. So the person who believes that it did start, Occam asks them, what are your reasons? And he says, well, there was a virus. It did start in Wuhan. And this wet lab is in Wuhan. This virus has affiliation with bats as an origin. And the wet market has an affiliation with bats being bought, eaten, butchered, etc. So that wet market makes sense there. Also, the wet market is environmentally correct for this type of thing. It's crowded and it's maybe not as sanitary as it should be. Plus we have, when there is butchering of animals, there is blood released, and blood is one of the primary transfers. Ebola in Africa, it's blood from the monkeys getting in little cuts from the hunters who butcher out the carcasses. So so it makes good sense for it would be there. China came out and said in the very beginning, this is an animal to human contact. That also fits right in with it being at the wet market. Science is saying that, and China is advocating that it is a natural mutation. So a natural mutation would come through that process, coming through the bats, arriving at the market, contaminating the person. Right after it found out, the market was closed, and it was sanitized really, really well. So that's why I believe that the wet market makes the most sense. Okay. So Occam then turns to the other person and says, why do you think that it is not so reasonable that the wet market would be involved with this? And that person would say, well, yes, there is a virus. It did originate in Wuhan. And yes, there is a wet market in Wuhan. And there is an affiliation with bats. But there are reports that there were no bats at the market, at least for a long time, and that nobody was eating bats. And if you don't have the bats there and you don't have the slaughter of the animals and the exposure of the blood and whatever to the people, that transfer from the bat or the animal to the person is very difficult to explain. If it was animal to human, as the Chinese authorities first assured the world, and I want to state here that when you're assured that it's animal to human, the world kind of breathes a sigh of relief, because it's not something that's going to spread person to person, that you have to shut down the airlines and whatever. It's associated with bats, and as long as not very many people are near bats, or with Ebola, not many people near monkeys. You sigh a little relief and you relax a bit. But they have found in testing the people that some of the very first people who had the virus had no contact with the wet lab at all. And if they didn't have any contact with the wet lab, and it's supposed to be an animal to human, how did they get it before anybody who was at the wet lab got it? And so we have to come to the conclusion that this thing is human to human, that somehow humans passed it to one another, and they did not need there to be a bat involved for that to occur. They could get it just from one and another. So that doesn't make sense with the wet market being the pathway of animal to human, because the evidence that is left shows that it wasn't. The first woman in Thailand to come down with it had no contact early. She came down with it early, had no contact with the wet market there. So it throws a big harpoon into that theory that the wet market had to be involved or was involved. Then, to further complicate that, we look at the response China made to this virus versus the response they made to the SARS virus. Now again, SARS virus was a natural mutation, kind of an act of God, and they assured us this was a natural mutation of the same magnitude, of the same type. Yet with SARS, they did not silence the whistleblower doctors. They did not close the lab that released the genome to the world, which enabled the world to develop tests for it. And they do that, and then China shuts that lab down. And it's the first contact people that had the virus. They take samples from that and they save those, and then they could start tracking the mutations of the viruses back. Well, all of those the people that were infected first, all of those samples are gone. So we can't go back and see where the virus looked like or what it was when it hit the first people. And there are no samples taken from that lab now. Market. So, you have this highfalutin lab, state of the art, not a mile away, and this terrible epidemic starts, and you would think that the, laboratory work 101 would say that we better go get some samples here and see if we can track this down. But that doesn't happen. The market is emptied, everything destroyed that could be, and then sanitized into oblivion, so there's no evidence left. And then the comment that this is a natural mutation somehow makes it only able to become from the market through a natural pathway doesn't go further to tell you that when you are in a BSL-4 laboratory making a virus from a bug into a really nasty one, the methodology is this animal passage, which we've talked about before, but as we know, the outcome of that, the look of that virus, looks like it has mutated naturally. It's not like they've snipped little pieces of different viruses into another virus where you can see that. Those look natural. So if all of this, the actions of the Chinese government in this is totally different than SARS. None of the arguments, saying that this is the wet market really hold water. And if we had the samples, we could maybe prove that, but for some reason, someone didn't want us to be able to prove that, so those samples are destroyed. So all of those things make me come to the conclusion that it did not come from the lab, from the wet market. I keep saying lab because in veterinary school, when you had a wet lab, you had live animals. Like if you're studying chickens, they brought in live ones. So I have wet lab on my mind, but wet market here. If I say wet lab, I mean wet market. So I believe that is the case for it. And Occam is going to have to throw in his 2 cents worth there. Well, Occam comes in and he says, first off, he says using his principles to do this is not the ideal case. Using scientific methods to do this with samples and testing and tracking and forensics and all of the tools we have available to a modern society, that is the best way to do this. But when somebody destroys all of that for you, you're sometimes left with, less than desirable. And these concepts from Occam at least give us a little bit of a framework for us going in and seeing what is the truth and what isn't and how to cut into it. So there are the 2 sides to that story.